Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us bright and early on a Sunday morning to talk about history, a subject that many adults and children who I meet do not profess a great fondness for. So, recently, I've been doing a whole lot of school engagements, talking to kids about their opinions on history. And one of the funniest questions I was asked by a young kid was, Ma'am, do you know that Akbar was actually only 4 feet tall and he used to run away from battles because he was so short? And this was absolutely a new story to me. I'd never heard of this. There's nothing in any of the sources I've encountered that suggests that Akbar was below average height or was particularly cowardly. Quite the opposite. But one of the things that made me start thinking about was how the lack of humanization of historical figures in textbooks, which is how kids primarily encounter history, tends to leave a gap. And that gap is filled by social media nonsense, essentially, that takes what is not historical and makes it seem so. So, one of the things that I started thinking about, and the reason why this book exists, is why does that gap exist? And what can we do to push back against it? What can we do to fill it with actual history that is accessible, that humanizes people from the past, and doesn't resort to generalizations, that is rooted in scholarship? So, of course, a lot of people, including myself, grow up with the baggage of bad history lessons in school, where we don't focus on the people of the past, but we talk about names and dates and the battles that people fought, or maybe sometimes the monuments that they built. But we don't really think about what was someone like as a child or what their favorite food was. And the result of this is that with lots of history, but especially with the Mughals, we come to understand them with preconceived notions about what like whether it was popular culture like Bollywood movies or Akbar Birbal folk tales, or of course modern day hot takes on the internet. And for me, it's now sort of a mission to try and find a way to make history accessible and engaging without compromising on scholarly rigor. So, the way that my co author and I have approached it, and a lot of people in India are now approaching it, is to take hold of history and put the story back into it, to essentially use narrative history as the approach and try and get people to engage with history and the people of history as human beings. So, what is narrative history? I mean, it's pretty. It's in the name. It's a way of writing history that moves beyond the primly sort of factual, sanitized approach that we take in our textbooks, and that uses the techniques that novelists do. So you take characterization, you create settings, you use the information that we have from primary sources, and you use it to weave a story about the past that's very much rooted in the sources, but is more accessible, more fun to read, more liked by people who live in our present day. All of these things aren't really new. Narrative history isn't a new concept. It's something that people have been doing for a long time outside of India. So for me, my own interest in history actually comes from when I was a kid reading a lot of British history. And the funny thing is, a lot of kids I meet today and adults say they're very interested in the world wars, they're very interested in medieval Europe, they're very interested in the American Civil War. You ask them about Indian history, they're like, maybe, I don't know, it's kind of boring. They just built a lot of temples or monuments, they fought a lot of battles. I don't really know much about Indian history. So the approach that I always take is, why not, why don't we write narrative history about Indian historical figures who lived very much three-dimensional lives, even though the way that we approach them in textbooks or other works tends not to take that into account. So I actually ended up doing a degree in medieval history, but British and European history. So I was learning Latin and Old Norse and reading about Beowulf and Viking sagas while not knowing much about the history of the place that I come from. And for me, that started becoming more and more of a problem. I wanted to find a way to engage with the history that is all around us. I now live in Delhi, and for me, living in Delhi and getting to sort of fall in love with the city was very much a part of writing the Book of Emperors, because engaging with the city from a historical perspective, helped to kind of get a sense of who we are right now through thinking about who the people who were before us, who occupied the same space, breathed the same air, probably fresher air than we get in Delhi these days, though. But the thing about the Mughals, and I get this question a lot, why the Mughals? Because there's this tendency, especially in the social media sphere, to say, oh, the Mughals have been glorified. Why do we keep glorifying the Mughals? And sometimes I think what people mean by glorified is just, oh, they're talked about a lot. And the reason they're talked about a lot, though, is just that there is so much to say about them. They occupied, or rather they take up such a large space in our imaginations because their empire lasted 300 years. It's very close in time to us. The last Mughal emperor died only 160 years ago. Like, it's not that far away in time, but it's also a product of the fact that they left such an enormous archive of information for us to look at. And that archive of information includes things like primary sources that were written by people who lived during that period. So the most famous being Babur's record of his life, the Tuzuk-i-Baburi or the Baburnama, which is one of the earliest records of the Mughal Empire and why this sort of imperial project even came to be. And Babur's record, it is an autobiography. It is definitely a selection of events from his life, but it's very frank, and it's written in this particularly almost uniquely honest style for the time that it was written in the 16th century. And it's a journal of his joys and his sorrows and how he came to rule at the age of 12, an age that most of my child readers find shocking because they're like, oh, I'm 12 years old. I would never survive in the world of violence the way that Babur did. But we know from his narrative that he was constantly on the move, that he had to fend off his own relatives because he was born in this violent world, this Timurid world where it was, if you showed any sign of weakness, then your kingdom was apt to be taken over by possibly your closest relatives, your brothers or your uncles. A thing that continued and that the Mughals brought with them to India, that continued to kind of destabilize their empire in India while they were here as well. So Babur's narrative takes us all the way through most of his life. There are sections missing that may have been lost earlier or that he never really had the chance to write. But they come to us in these very clear, simple sentences where he talks about being in a garden when he gets the news of his father dying in a freak accident. He talks about being married off to this girl in a political alliance, but not really feeling much about this woman in his life. At the same time, he talks about falling in love with a boy in the marketplace just because he has a pretty face. And these little details about his life and his insight that he gives us into who he is as a person, it's very hard to demonize someone when you're able to access that part of them, when this vulnerability that's on display makes you sort of have a bit more sympathy for someone like a Babur. Of course, Babur's diary isn't really like a diary in the modern sense. It was written for other people to read. So it's very much a selected and an artistic, a stylized account of what his life was like, but it's still frank and informal in a way that lots of writing at the time just wasn't. You didn't have insight into the mind of a conqueror, a warrior, a king in the way that the Baburnama gives it to you. And so the way that he talks about his emotions when the grief that he felt at a friend's death, the despair that he feels at losing his homeland and going on exile, a time that he calls his throneless days, where he was reduced to having nothing more than just 2 tents. And one of those was given off to his mother. And so he just slept out in the open because he wanted his mother to sleep in comfort. He talks about how he relied on his grandmother for advice because she was a very wise woman and he never took any decisions without her counsel. So he also, one of my favorite stories about him is he talks about Humayun. He writes this letter to Humayun criticizing his flowery and overly verbose style of writing, saying, why can't you just write more directly? Just stop using all of these unnecessary words. And then he also writes exasperatedly about Humayun being late to battle. And this is on his campaign to India when Babur and his enormous army are waiting and Humayun doesn't show up on the appointed day. And then he gets very angry. He sends an angry note off to Humayun saying, saying, "Where are you? Why haven't you arrived yet? We're supposed to go off to India." And all of these little bits and pieces of information just humanize this person who lived 500 years ago in a way that other texts that we have access to just don't do. So, speaking of Frank, though, here's a lovely painting made in Akbar's time. And that little figure encircled is Babur. And this is actually a moment when Babur was in Kabul, which he had conquered after losing his homeland. And he was comfortable in a place for a long time for the first time. And he discovered alcohol. And so he had these very rowdy parties with his friends, and one of those parties involved going out on a boat and rowing around, and then Babur rides drunkenly back into camp, and that's him sort of listing off his horse, almost falling over. And he writes in his diary about how he has barely any memory of this party, but it was a very good party. So with Akbar, the thing about the Baburnama is, of course, it was in fragments. But when Akbar came to the throne, Babur's grandson, he had this desire to find a way to document his ancestors' lives, both his father's and his grandfather's. And what he ended up doing was commissioning a translation of the Baburnama from the original Turki into Persian, and commissioning a whole bunch of paintings. So the previous painting I showed you, and later ones as well, were commissioned by Akbar as a record of his ancestors. Of course, Akbar is probably the first Mughal that anyone thinks of when you mention the name of the dynasty. And we talk about him in terms of keywords. We say, oh, he created the Mansabdari system. He started this thing called Dini Ilahi. Some people say it's a religion, some people say it's not. So it's a very sort of, he was religiously tolerant. That's pretty much all that any kids that I talk to, and a lot of adults, seem to know about him. But there was so much more to Akbar than that. And I think the thing that comes out the most in the historical record is how daring he was. And to an extent, we have to think about, did he want people to think of him as daring? And was that part of what shaped how he was written about? Because a lot of the incidents, the best known incidents from Akbar's life, highlight how courageous, how devil-may-care, how sort of out there he was for his time. So one of the documents that kind of most powerfully exhibits this is this incident, this painting of a very well-known incident from Akbar's youth. When he was 19 years old, he was just coming into his own as an emperor, and he decided to ride an elephant. Not just any elephant, but the worst-tempered elephant in his stables. And he decided to ride this elephant into battle with another elephant that was equally bad-tempered. Of course, this went very poorly. This was outside the Agra fort. One elephant decided to run away from the battle. The elephant that Akbar was riding, you can see him in white, followed, and they were running across a very unstable bridge of boats, a pontoon bridge outside the fort. And at this point, we hear in the record that all of Akbar's courtiers came running out into the sort of environs of where this was happening, yelling out to the Padshah, "Please get off the elephant. We can't afford to lose you at this point. We've just about achieved stability in the empire." And Akbar roars back, "Just stop. I am fine. I will take care of it. Don't worry about me." And of course, he is fine, and he continues. He was 19 here. He only died at 63 after a long, long, long life of always charging into battle first, always putting himself in danger, always being on the front lines, because that's just the kind of person he was. And it wasn't just about physical bravery. It was also a kind of intellectual pushing of boundaries that he engaged in. And in this picture, you can see that he's got Jesuit priests. You can see that he's got people of a whole bunch of different religious persuasions in the building that he built, the Ibadat Khana, where he deliberately had people from a lot of different religious communities, whether it was Parsis, Portuguese priests, Shias, Sunnis, Jains, Buddhists, Hindus, people from every conceivable religious group that he could think of in India come and debate. And he would ask them pointed questions like, is there really a God? Why does God want us to do certain things? And the whole point of it was him trying to seek answers. So everybody kind of vaguely knows that Akbar did not learn how to read and write, or was possibly dyslexic. But he was also someone who was deeply fond of stories and very, very interested in knowledge. And he had this enormous kitab khana, his library, where he had translators and artists and calligraphers producing many, 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 many manuscripts, including translations of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, because he wanted to understand the world around him. And he would have people read these stories to him every day. And he apparently developed a very, very sharp memory, and he rarely forgot what he heard. And part of all of this intellectual journeying got him to the point where he decided that none of these religions, none of the people around him who were professing all of these different faiths had concrete answers. And to him, that meant no one religion should be allowed to oppress any other. That nothing is superior to anything else, because no one has any real answers. And that is something that came to define who he was. It wasn't something that made him popular with everybody. The Islamic clergy did not approve of his heresies as they saw it. In fact, so there are two famous documents that exist, histories that were produced in Akbar's time. One was Abul Fazl's Akbarnama, which a lot of people have heard of. It's very hard to read because it's incredibly fawning. It praises Akbar in every single line. It's very, for a modern reader, it's tough to get through all of that, what we would think of as just sucking up to the emperor. But when you try and get through it, you're like, oh, okay, this is, Abul Fazl was Akbar's buddy. He was his friend. He would go drinking with him. They would have parties together. So there's a degree to which the Akbarnama may overstate Akbar's greatness. But as a counter, you had Abdul Qadir Badauni's narrative, which was completely critical of Akbar, and especially critical of his religious exploration, which Badauni, who was quite a lot more orthodox and religious than Akbar himself or Abul Fazl, deeply disapproved of. And the interesting thing about this counter narrative is that it was written in secret, and it wasn't known, it wasn't available for public consumption or even just known of until 10 years into Jahangir's reign. So well after Akbar could do anything about it. But there's something really fun about the fact that you have these two very, very different narratives talking about the same king. And even though Abul Fazl praises Akbar, it's the very same things that Akbar is praised for that Badauni critiques him for, which is a gold mine for anyone trying to write about a historical figure. So after Akbar, we have my favorite Mughal emperor, Jahangir. And he is my favorite because he feels like the most knowable of the great Mughals. He's the most frank and honest in his own autobiography, the Jahangirnama, even though as a writer of history, you have to remember that he was writing for public consumption. He wasn't writing a diary just for himself. He was writing it as an instructional sort of manual for his sons on what a good king is supposed to be like. And so a big part of that was saying, oh, look at all the great things I've done. Look at all the charity that I perform. There are lots and lots and lots of records in the Jahangirnama of who got which promotion and how much did I donate to charity when I traveled on this journey. So it's very much a performance of this is what a good king should be like. But we can still get a lot of who this emperor was as a person through the course of reading it. So this painting sort of epitomizes a lot of that. It shows you Jahangir standing on a fish and a bull and a globe on top of it. The fish and the bull are part of this, the way that we have the turtle and the elephants in the Hindu conception of cosmology. This is the Islamic conception of where the earth is. So you have Jahangir standing on top of it because his name means world conqueror, and he is shooting at a disembodied head. The disembodied head belongs to Malik Ambar, Jahangir's enemy, an Ethiopian general who was employed by the Ahmednagar Sultanate. He was someone that Jahangir particularly had a bugbear against because the Mughal armies were never really able to defeat him. And so Jahangir would send army after army to defeat Malik Ambar, only for those armies to be sent packing. So at one point, in sheer frustration, I like to think, he commissioned his artists to produce this wish-fulfilling sort of painting, showing him shooting at the disembodied head of his enemy. Malik Ambar did not die at Jahangir's hand. In fact, I don't think Jahangir ever actually saw Malik Ambar, and neither did the artist. So this is just an imagined version of what he might have looked like. And as if to underscore the point, you have an owl sitting on top of the head. An owl was considered particularly unlucky. So if just being disembodied and being shot at wasn't unlucky enough, you have an owl on top to tell you so. But also, if you look at that sort of chain that looks like it's golden bells, that is something that Jahangir mentions in his memoirs, where he talks about coming to the throne and issuing 12 proclamations. One of these is that people should not drink alcohol, a rule that he did not follow himself at all, but one that he liked to say that he enacted. One of the other things he talked about was a chain of justice. So he apparently had this chain of justice installed outside the fort in Agra, and it was meant to be something that could be tugged at by anybody, any member of the empire, any subject of the empire, who would then get the emperor's attention and get him to deliver justice. Of course, Jahangir only mentions this chain once when he comes to the throne. Never again do we hear of anyone using the chain, but it was important for him to say, hey, I put up a chain of justice when I came to the throne. But the thing that Jahangir, I think, is the most known for is his incredible interest in the natural world. And he was famous for loving painting, and he had an enormous atelier of painters at his command who were producing art, and a lot of what they produced were natural history paintings. So this, I had to include this because my co-author and illustrator loves this particular painting, and he cannot get enough of the fact that the chameleon is so lifelike, and you can even see its pupils sort of in the direction of that little shadowy moth or other insect that's there at the top. And this is by a painter called Mansoor, who was one of Jahangir's greatest natural history painters. And Jahangir traveled a lot around his empire. Throughout his reign, he was constantly moving from place to place, often just on journeys of pleasure. He might say in his diary that, oh, I'm going here to support the army. They're off on an expedition. I will camp near them. But he never really went to war. He wasn't a battle-loving, conquering sort of king the way that his father was. He was someone who loved the good things in life, the finer things in life. And that included traveling in an extremely luxurious camp, which was full of all the best things that Jahangir could have had at his fort: the carpets, the beautiful furniture, the music, the alcohol, the good food, and his painters. So everywhere he went, he had his painters travel with him and produce paintings like these. And he also records doing all of these, what we might think of today as proto-scientific experiments. Some of my favorites include him traveling to Ahmedabad because he'd never been to Gujarat, and he decided to travel to Ahmedabad, and he is very frank about not liking the city at all and nicknaming it the city of dust because it's so dusty and unhealthy. And to prove that he is right about it, he orders that a sheep carcass be hung up in Ahmedabad and that another one be hung up in a neighboring city about 100 kilometers away. And he then asks people to measure at what rate they rot. And when the sheep carcass in Ahmedabad rots faster, he's like, yes, see, I told you, the air here is very unhealthy. Similarly, he also does this other experiment where, according to the locals, he's traveling around, I think this is towards the northwest of Delhi, and he comes across a river, a little stream or a river, where the locals say there's a crocodile. And so Jahangir, of course, has to test whether this is true or not. So he orders a sheep to be thrown in the river. And the sheep, poor sheep, swims across to the other side and lands there safely. So Jahangir is like, okay, that's one level of this experiment. Then he orders a servant to swim the length of the river to see if they're eaten by the crocodile. And then when the servant arrives on the other side safely, he's like, I have disproved that there was ever a crocodile in this river. If there was one, it's not there anymore. And he's very pleased with himself every time he comes across these local myths or stories. He takes it upon himself to disprove them or to test them out. But as much as he loves animals, and he talks a lot about capturing animals and having them to observe in his own palaces. So very famously, he had this pair of Sarus cranes, and he made sure that they were very well taken care of, and he was very proud when they mated and produced an egg, and he had the eggs brought to him and then replaced carefully in the nest. And then when the chicks were born, he noted down how the father also cared for the chicks the way that the mother did. All of this deep observation gives you a sense that, oh yeah, he's, maybe he could be an animal rights activist, he cares so much. But then he talks about crossbreeding goats, and he talks about how the kids were so cute, and they jumped around, and he was very thrilled by their antics. But in the very next sentence, he says, I wonder how they would taste if they were cooked in a curry. And so when you read that, you're like, maybe not. Maybe you crossbreed the goats and you like them while they're alive, but you're also thinking about how they would taste when they can no longer engage in these antics. So at moments like that, you're like, I feel like I know you, but also there is a huge gulf of hundreds of years between how we feel about things. There's some more paintings by Mansoor. Shah Jahan was very, very different from his father. As open and as sort of empathetic as Jahangir can be, Shah Jahan does not come across the same way. He was very, very concerned in a sort of contradictory way to his father with controlling the narrative. He did not write his own autobiography, and even the histories that were written during his reign were very controlled. Everything had to be submitted to the Padshah and had to be approved by him. In fact, even his portraits, it is said that the way that people today take selfies knowing their good sides, he very much knew his good side. And he always insisted on being depicted in this sort of profile way. And because we were looking at a lot of paintings while looking for references for the book, you see portraits of Shah Jahan. I forgot to put one in here, but portraits of Shah Jahan from his father's reign, where he looks a lot more like Jahangir. He looks very Indian. But then when you look at this sort of portrait, he looks a lot more Persian. The skin is fairer, the nose is sharper, the cheekbones are more defined than in his portraits made under Jahangir. So there's a sort of like an art historian friend and I were talking about how maybe he started because he was very invested in being Timurid. He was very invested in his Central Asian heritage, even though he had 3 Rajput grandparents. He did not necessarily embrace that side of him as much as his Timurid lineage. And so in his portraits, the paintings that he commissioned of himself, he perhaps asked his painters to make him look as Persian as possible. The other thing, of course, is that the portraits from his period are a lot more formal, and they're a lot more about lines and angles and just very straightforward. The way that Akbar's portraits are full of action, Shah Jahan's portraits are a lot more static. They're quite different because he was an emperor who liked rule and order. In fact, if you were in Shah Jahan's court, you wouldn't be allowed to speak unless spoken to, and you might have to spend hours and hours saying nothing in silence, standing and waiting for the emperor to tell you what to do next. So he might not have been a very pleasant person to be around. Certainly his son Aurangzeb did not think of him as a pleasant person. And one of the things I found really surprising and interesting about the relationship between Shah Jahan and Aurangzeb was just how much that childhood resentment of Shah Jahan openly favoring his eldest son shaped how Aurangzeb treated his father later on. Famously, of course, Aurangzeb imprisoned his father in the Agra fort and refused to allow him to do anything before usurping his throne. And I always think about how family dynamics very likely shaped how that relationship led to Aurangzeb taking over. Aurangzeb, a popular figure for being sort of villainized, and especially someone who I think benefits a lot from closer study. The more I came to Aurangzeb, reading about Aurangzeb, with a lot of preconceived notions, but the more I got to know him, the more he made me feel sympathetic to him, which is not a feeling I expected to have. So I put in 2 letters. So the thing about Aurangzeb is we have this collection of translated letters, and it's fantastic to read these letters that he writes to his sons. He is every bit a controlling dad. And he's written, so to his eldest son, the top letter is essentially talking about how it's a criticism on his eldest son's choice of fashion. And he's like, "You're 47 years old. Why are you wearing the color yellow? It doesn't go with your white beard." And in the second one, it's to his second son, where it's this incredibly passive aggressive letter saying, "There was a cook who made a really good khichdi and a biryani, but you refused to give me your cook. So I am going to now task you with finding me a cook who is as good." And when you read these letters, you get this sense of Aurangzeb as being a deeply controlling and passive aggressive and kind of annoying human being to be around. And a lot of it seems to go back to his own poor relationship with his dad and his brothers and sisters, and that emerging in the way that he dealt with his own sons. And he didn't have a great relationship with his sons. And it is something that, speaking of his letters, towards the end of his life, he writes a goodbye letter to his sons. And it is an incredibly sad letter in which he talks about coming into the world alone and leaving it alone. And he questions the point of everything he's done in his very long life. He's nearly 90 years old, and he very frankly and very honestly says, "I don't know if I've done the right thing, and I hope God forgives me if I haven't." And when you read those things, it's hard to see him as someone who is purely evil. It's hard to see him as someone who is just black or white. It's just a complicated human being living in a time where the choices that he made shaped the lives of millions, but a lot of it comes from who he was as a person, how he was raised, the tragedies that he experienced in his life, and how that shaped him and made him make certain choices. We've been talking a lot about Mughal men. But of course, there were lots and lots of Mughal women who had very rich, very interesting, often exciting lives that colonial histories, which is the way that a lot of Mughal history is received by us today, completely erase. And Mughal women exercised a great amount of power all through the course of the empire. Given the brevity with which I have to speak today, I've just picked three of them at random. Gulbadan Begum was Babur's daughter, the first Mughal girl to travel to India from Kabul, and she lived an incredibly interesting life. She was part of Babur's entourage that came to India, and she lived at a time where Mughal women weren't sequestered. They weren't put into a harem and sort of kept away from the sight of everybody else. There was still a practice of veiling, but they still traveled. They still moved around a lot. In fact, Babur's mother traveled with him in camps. Babur's grandmother traveled with him in camps. So this whole practice of putting Mughal women into a harem actually came after Akbar married a Rajput princess, and he borrowed that custom in India. But before that, Gulbadan and other women like her traveled a lot. And in fact, Gulbadan refused to be sequestered in a harem. She demanded that she travel not just any short distance, that she travel all the way to Mecca on the Hajj. She was, in fact, part of a group of 11 women who traveled on the Hajj, spent 4 years away from the court, just doing their own thing, traveling around, practicing charity, irritating the Ottoman Sultan because apparently they were creating a ruckus wherever they went. And she is someone who gives us insight into the domestic world of the Mughals. She talks about what a wedding looked like. She talks about how the camps were set up and the complaints of older Mughal women when Humayun wasn't visiting them enough. And they were like, "Why aren't you visiting us enough?" It's the way that, older aunts that we're related to might say, "Oh, you haven't been by in 3 years. What's happened? Why aren't you giving me enough attention?" And she also gives us insight into, again, like how family dynamics shaped things. Humayun had a lot of trouble with his brothers. So she recounts how they had these endless arguments about the best course of action to take when Sher Shah Sur was hot on their heels. And she is the one who tells us this very famous story about Babur's death and how it happened because of a ritual that he was part of, where Humayun had fallen deathly ill. And apparently, the only way, Babur went to a bunch of healers, and he went to some religious men, and he asked, how can I save my son? And they suggested this particular folk ritual where Babur would have to circumambulate Humayun's bed 3 times and then speak out loud that he was giving up something dear to him in exchange for Humayun's life. And the thing that Babur spoke out loud was, "Take my life in exchange for my son's." And the story goes, according to Gulbadan, that very soon after Humayun recovered, Babur fell very ill and died. And so, in her version, Babur died to save his son. Here we've got this portrait of Noor Jahan. it's supposed to be of Noor Jahan. It is not absolutely identified, but it's the only portrait we have of a Mughal woman standing in this very masculine pose and loading a gun, loading a musket. In fact, when I show this to a lot of audiences, they definitely think it's a man, especially kids. They're like, oh, that's a man, right? Which emperor is it? And I'm like, actually, it's an empress. So Noor Jahan was famously a very good shot. In fact, Jahangir, in one of his mentions in his memoirs, talks about how she, from a howdah that was covered, actually managed to kill 4 tigers with just 6 shots, which was an incredible feat. And Noor Jahan was also someone who she was the only empress to have her name on coins. She was the only empress to sit in a jharoka. She controlled lands in her own right. And most interestingly, she married Jahangir after she had lost her first husband when she was in her 30s. The story goes that they met at a Meena Bazaar and they saw each other, and Jahangir instantly fell in love with her, asked her to marry him, and they had a very happy marriage. But the story that I love the most about her is that towards the end of his reign, Jahangir actually managed to get himself kidnapped by one of his own generals, and the person to ride to his rescue was his wife, Noor Jahan, who got on an elephant and rallied up an army and went off to rescue her husband. The other woman you see is Jahanara. I always find it really interesting that she is portrayed with a scroll of paper as a signifier of her scholarly pursuits. She was a Sufi murid. She was accepted by a peer as his disciple, and she wrote 2 books, one a biography of this peer and another one that was about her explorations of faith. And she was an incredibly intelligent and a very wealthy young woman. At the age of 17, she was the richest woman in the empire because her father had given her most of her mother's wealth, most of Mumtaz Mahal's money when she died, and her properties went to Jahanara. And Jahanara occupied a position as the sort of first lady of the Mughal Empire, and she essentially raised her younger siblings as a maternal figure. But one of the saddest things for her is that she loved all of her siblings, but the sibling that she was most connected to, the sibling that she loved the most, was her older brother, Dara Shikoh. And she at one point is torn between Dara Shikoh and Aurangzeb because, of course, the 2 brothers are at loggerheads. And there's this incredibly poignant moment where Aurangzeb has besieged Agra fort and he's cut off the water supply to force Shah Jahan to to give up and surrender. And Jahanara goes out to intercede. And in a last-ditch effort, she says, what if we partition the empire? What if you and your eldest son got the lion's share, everybody else got a little bit, piece of the empire, and then we had peace? And it's an offer that comes too late. And the sadness of having this one princess who clearly loves all of her family but is unable to broker a peace is very moving. And it's this moment that really makes it clear what was at stake. It's not just about the money or the power or the empire. It's really about the life of a brother that she loves. So the further you go into the history of the Mughal Empire, the more you get distanced from the center. So you have someone like Jahangir whose voice you can actually hear through his writing, but the further you go, you have a Shah Jahan who's only represented by his official court histories, and later you mostly hear about the Mughals through European or colonial narratives. This painting is one I love talking about because it was made by a British painter. It commemorates a pivotal moment in Indian history. It commemorates the moment when the Emperor Shah Alam handed over the right of Diwani to Robert Clive, essentially giving the East India Company the right to tax the 3 richest provinces of the empire, Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. This, of course, looks very grand. It looks like a very respectful ceremony where they're handing over the paperwork, and it's all very ceremonial. But the dome at the back is more like St. Paul's Cathedral than any Mughal dome because the painter who made this painting never came to India. He also probably had no idea what Shah Alam looked like, so he gave him a very generic Indian-looking face with generic Indian-looking clothes, and you got the British people very respectfully receiving the Diwani. In truth, it looked more like that, where at the end of the Battle of Buxar, Robert Clive had Shah Alam in his clutches. The emperor had no resources, had surrendered, had really nothing else to do besides put his faith in the British. And what happened was Robert Clive escorted Shah Alam into his tent, took his dining table, threw an armchair on top of it, threw a quilt on top of that, and said, "Here you go, sit on this makeshift throne and hand over the right for me to tax these three provinces." So it's just one of those moments where you've got the colonial narrative, which is so beautiful and respectful, and you've got the truth, which is far from. And as you go further towards the end of the empire, you have an emperor who has little power outside the Red Fort. This is from the reign of Akbar Shah II, the penultimate Mughal emperor, who was not allowed to do almost anything without the approval of the British resident. He couldn't travel outside the fort without the approval of the resident, and he also depended on the British for a pension that they were meant to pay in full for him to support his family, which they didn't over and over. And so in the end, he resorted to having this beautiful, very European style painting made of himself that he sent to the reigning British monarch in the hope that it would inspire them to actually pay out the pension. In fact, a fun thing that I learned, which I didn't know when I was reading about Akbar Shah II, is that he engaged Raja Ram Mohan Roy as his envoy to the British king. And although Mohan Roy died in Britain without really achieving anything, that was a little piece of trivia that I didn't know about Raja Ram Mohan Roy and his life. So that brings us all the way 300 years down to the end of empire. And there's so much you can say about the Mughals. It was hard for me to try and pick the things that I wanted to talk about today. And that's kind of what is most exciting about them. Every time I read a new book about the Mughals, or I try to like prep for one of these events, I find a new fact. And I'm like, how much did these people do? How much more is there to know about them? And the answer is there is a lot. There's so much more to be said about the Mughals. And I really hope that more work can be done on them, because as much as there is material out there, there's still so much that we don't know about their world. And I think if we want to push back against stories that cast them as villains, or kind of selectively present information, or make stuff up like Akbar being 4 feet tall, the only way to do it is to go back to the sources and read them and find ways to humanize these people who are very much part of our past. I just wanted to end with a little moment that I found particularly sweet and sad from the reign of Akbar Shah II, which I will read from the book. So, late in Akbar Shah II's reign, an English woman with the unusual name of Mrs. Mir Hassan Ali happened to make a visit to the Qila-e-Mualla, the Red Fort. The wife of a Muslim scholar and teacher from Lucknow, Mrs. Ali was one of many British visitors to the court, ordinary men and women who were curious about the fort and the Padshah within it. By this time, most of the palaces Shah Jahan had carefully built long ago were run down. A visitor in 1824 reported seeing dirty floors, blocked water channels, broken furniture covered in pigeon droppings, and a garden in the sort of disorder that would have brought Babur to tears. Yet when Mrs. Ali arrived in the emperor's presence, she took care to observe the expected courtesies. She took off her shoes before entering the king's presence. She bowed low and offered both Akbar Shah and his queen gifts before taking a seat beside the queen. The emperor, she would write, possessed a fine and intelligent face, and his manner of speech was gentle and refined. Both he and the queen asked Mrs. Ali many questions and seemed curious about everything, from her family life to the customs of English royalty to how well she liked the weather in India. Mrs. Ali reportedly impressed them with her ability to speak in their own language. When she rose to depart, she was pressed to accept two gifts by the queen, an embroidered scarf and a small ring. It was an awkward moment. Mrs. Ali did not wish to refuse them because that would cause offense. But she was embarrassed at having to take valuable things away from a couple that had so little left. Once, the Padshah of Hindustan had been the richest man in the world. But by 1837, he was just an old man whose wretched circumstances elicited the pity of a passing traveler. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashwita. That was So entertaining and such a joy to listen to. As was your book, which was really, I enjoyed it so much. So congratulations on that.
Thank you.
So my first question, Ashwita, is like, this is rather an unusual format, an illustrated book. What made you write this illustrated book, which seems to be targeting not just children, but also older people?
Thank you. It is a format that a lot of people have been confused by, including booksellers, because when you look at illustrated books, the general tendency is to think that they're for kids. But it isn't. The book isn't written in a style that's only for children. It's written in a style that's narrative, like I started off talking about. And the thing with the Mughals was we felt that an illustrated book would be a really interesting way to capture this culture that is so visual. And so much of what we know about the Mughals and what we have that's left of their legacy is visual. It's their architecture, it's their art, it's their textiles, it's their paintings. And we felt that a way of making the book more immersive and making people feel sort of transported into the past as a way of accompanying this narrative that is aiming to do the same thing was to choose this illustrated format. And so far it's been successful. Both kids have appreciated it and older people who, like I said, have that memory of history class being a time to take naps or doodle or stare out the window, have read it and said, hey, I didn't know that history could be so entertaining. I had no idea it could be so colorful. And part of that, I think, is just that the book is literally colorful.
Yeah. So some of the really attractive things about the book are these very sumptuous double-page spreads that you have, like this, and each of them is targeting a topic which is not necessarily part of the narratives, but it is still an important aspect of Mughal lives, right? So, and there's some really interesting things. There are topics on women. There's about the feasting, about hunting. Lots of things like that. So, were there topics that you really wanted to include but couldn't?
Yeah, we only had a limited number of pages. Our publisher was very strict about that, and we also we didn't have the time. So of course the spreads are so detailed that they took a lot of time for Nikhil to research and do, and for us to figure out exactly the right balance between the text and the art, because you want the art to pop and you want the text to just be something that gives context. So there was one spread we really wanted to do, which was about the information or the spy networks. Like Aurangzeb had a very, very strong network of spies, and these spies were the ones who probably notified him of his son Muazzam wearing a yellow robe. Or there's another moment where one of the spies has reported to him that, oh, Muazzam celebrated this festival in the Persian style, and Aurangzeb writes him an angry letter saying, how dare you celebrate in the Persian style. So there's lots and lots of these. He had a strong network of informants, and a lot of the emperors relied on these, and we wanted to do one on spies and soldiers, but we didn't have the time. And we also wanted to do stuff on festivals, because a big part of the Mughal court was celebrating Dasera and Holi and Diwali, and we wanted to have a spread about that, or even the weighing ceremony. On the emperor's solar and lunar birthdays, you would have them be weighed, and what they would be weighed against gold and money and grain, food stuff, and all of that would be donated to charity. So we wanted to do stuff like that, but again, there just wasn't enough room.
So, speaking of the Mughals, I'm guessing there's just like so much material that you could draw from, right? There are, like you said, there's the Jahangirnama, Babarnama, Akbarnama, etc. Especially when you're speaking about the earlier Mughals. So it seems like there was a problem of plenty, right? And you've got these really interesting stories. You did mention some in the talk, but there were some which I really liked, like about how was it Jahangir who asks his people to all wear oleanders in their hair, and such little details. And then the other one about Humayun, who's very focused on astrology, and so he has these days of the week when he will only wear this color, and all his people have to only wear that color, and they all have to work on only the thing which is dictated by astrology, is dedicated to that day or whatever. So there are these little details, but again, how did you? There must have been so many more. So which are the ones you left out, and how did you decide to?
Oh,
What to
so
include,
many.
what to leave out?
So one of the, again, because of wanting to make it a certain size, and that's partly dictated by a publisher and partly by the fact that we wanted it to be accessible to a really wide audience, adults, children alike. So the way that we approached it was, with each emperor, at least how I thought of it was, let me find one theme or one idea that most represents who they are. So with Akbar, the idea was he was a daredevil. He pushed boundaries physically but also intellectually. And he engaged in these, for example, marrying Rajput princesses and bringing the Rajputs into the Mughal fold. That was something that he did more of than anybody else before him or after him. Or with Humayun, it was this idea that he was so obsessed with astrology and he was so dependent on, looking to the stars for his choices and his decisions. And in fact, like I forgot to put it in the book, or like there wasn't enough room to put it in, but it's his name actually means fortunate, and he is truly one of the most unfortunate Mughal kings. He comes to the throne, he loses his throne very quickly to Sher Shah Sur, and he's wandering around in the desert. And so much of his, like, I found it really inspiring in a weird way, that someone who comes to the throne and loses everything he has, and he's just literally wandering around in the desert with two camels, and he has nothing to his name, but he fights back and he goes all the way to Persia. He manages to get this very irascible Persian Shah to give him an army, and he comes back and he defeats his brothers, and he still manages to stay positive throughout it all. Like, he's betrayed by his half brothers so many times, but at the end, when he finally captures the half brother who is the most, this is a story I couldn't put in the book, who's been the thorn in his side from the beginning, and all of his noblemen are saying, you have to put him to death or you have to blind him. And Humayun's like, do I really? Do I have to? I don't want to. He's just this person who is so emotionally vulnerable and just sweet. And it's shocking to me that he ever ended up going and reconquering his empire. So trying to focus on little strands like that so with Jahangir, it's this idea that he was the first to actually get to enjoy his empire, to travel around and take in all the sights and really appreciate what he was ruling over. Or with Shah Alam, the thread was tragedy. He lived an incredibly long life, but he just could not catch a break. He kept trying to get his empire back together. He kept trying different strategies to get the Mughal Empire to be what it had been, but nothing worked. And he had to live through all of it and see it all, and in fact live through a horrible moment where he's blinded and left to die by one of his vassals. And just the tragedy of that, like, that was the theme. So with each of these, the thing to do for us was find a thread, find something that epitomizes each emperor, and then we choose the stories that best represent what that emperor was all about. But of course, as you say, lots had to be left out.
Okay. So basically, you've done this really lovely job of bringing these people to life. They're no longer just characters in a textbook or in a book. They are real people, and you can sense that. So when you speak about how Babur is heartbroken at one point and with grief when his father passes away, I think, right? And the way you've put it is, you say, one moment he's talking about grief and you think, oh gosh, he's like us. And then next moment he's talking about piling up skulls and you think, gosh, what was that about? But so I was wondering about this. So you're focusing on the who, you're making these people real, right? Relatable. But do you think that there is a role for narrativizing history, which can be used to go beyond not just the what and the when, not the who, but also the why of histories?
Yeah, I definitely think there is room for that. In fact, when you're talking to adults, you don't have to explain why someone wants power, because we already understand it. But when I'm talking to a child audience and I say, oh, this person wanted a kingdom, or Babur, I think I quote where he says, oh, when you have a desire for conquest, you can't just give up when things don't go your way. And often kids are like, huh, why? But why do you have a desire for conquest? I don't get it. Like, why do you need power? Why do you need to be a king? And that, I think, the why is much harder to explain in our modern terms. So I have to try and say, oh, you might want to be a class leader, or you might want to be captain of your football team. Like, you have to find ways to connect it to what we recognize as wanting power in our world. And I agree with you. I think it's only when you use analogy and you try to connect why people were motivated to do certain things in the past, and connected to how those same motivations play out in the present day, that we're able to get that handle on why these things existed or why empires were built, any of it. So I absolutely think narrative, and especially analogy, connecting it to present day concerns, helps us understand the past better without judgment. Because I think judging people in the past is kind of a fruitless exercise. There's no point to saying, oh, these people were heroes, or these people were villains, or I'm so proud of so and so building such and such structure. I don't understand that at all. Like, why should I take pride in someone building a dam 300 years ago? Like, I don't understand that at all.
Right.
That's the, yeah. So I think, yeah, narrative definitely has a role to play.
Okay. What about, I mean, there are large periods in history, not just Indian history, when we don't have people as such. Like, we don't, I mean, of course we have people, but we don't have events, we don't have personalities, like we don't have any particular emperor or queen or any such thing. So, like, if you think of, for instance, the Iron Age, we don't really know anyone who lived at that time. How would you go about narrativizing this kind of history?
That's a really good question. I've most of my interest in history has been sort of from the medieval period onwards, so it's been easy. I'm like, oh, we have plenty of textual sources. It's easy to connect with these people. But I am very inspired by my co-author and the person who illustrated the book wrote this book, a comic book history called The People of the Indus, and in it he uses art to imagine what this world might have been like. And in fact, the book opens with a family packing up their belongings, putting them in a cart, and traveling to the city of Mohenjo-daro. And it's this beautiful, wordless sequence of images that these people are dressed differently, the things they have are different, the place that they're in is different, but somehow that sequence of images connects you to them immediately. You understand these are people who are migrants, they're moving, they're going to a city in search of a job, something that a lot of us have done. And there's a little dog that accompanies them and walks along behind the cart. And it's just like, I saw it back before it was published, and it just immediately just was like, this is perfect. This is how you take the history of a place like the Indus Valley civilization, a period that feels so far removed, and you make it feel immediate. And I think that's how I would go about it. Like, use art, use visuals, and try to imagine, because they're people after all. At the end of the day, they needed food, they needed shelter, they needed love, they needed companionship, they had dogs as pets. There's so many threads that unite us and them, despite the thousands of years between us, that I think finding those common threads of humanity and expressing them through art and text would be the way to go about it.
Do you think there's a role for historical fiction?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I love historical fiction. I think, and when done well, it can be memorable in a way that, like, your just dry facts and figures aren't. In fact, my introduction to a lot of different periods of history has been through good historical fiction. Not the bad kind that's just like modern story with a vague historical veneer over it, but the really good stuff. It can make the past feel alive in a way that is really valuable.
Okay. So you did, I think, allude to this in the talk a little bit, but also in your book, you've talked about how the way we look at the Mughals has changed over time, right? From being, as you said, glorified at one point. Now we are thinking, now, not we, but now the story seems to be more that they were basically, we're just focusing on the violence and oppression kind of thing. So basically, they've become like a controversial topic. So did this weigh on your mind when you were working on this? Did you think about how your book was going to be received, or did you change anything because this thought was running in your head? Did it run in your head at all?
Oh, not when we started out, but definitely because we started working on it in the pandemic, when we were kind of, you're in a bubble and you don't really know what's happening in the outside world. But as time went on, it took us, I think, about 2.5, nearly 3 years to work on the book. And through the course of time, it did weigh on us more and more. And I would make jokes about it, like, oh, no one's going to like that we're talking about the Mughals, and we're not saying they're evil, oppressive conquerors. But to me, it felt more and more important to do, because I, as someone who loves history and is deeply invested in how it's told, I don't believe that removing context is right. And I don't believe that focusing on certain aspects of a particular empire while ignoring everything else is right. So it's just, even though it didn't start out as a political book, it felt political by the end of it, just because we were saying, hey, let's look at history with nuance. Let's not cast people in the roles of heroes and villains. So a lot of people have, it's kind of surprising to me, so many people, kids and adults, have told me, I thought Aurangzeb was really bad, and then I read your book, and oh, he had such a sad life. And he was so alone, and even the woman he fell in love with died within a year of him meeting her, and his father didn't love him. Of course he did terrible things because he was so neglected. And I'm like, I'm glad that way of telling his story has made him less a caricature and more a well-rounded human being. And I get this question a lot, where people say, were the Mughals good or bad? Was Aurangzeb good or evil? And lots of people, like, I've had 10-year-olds ask it to me, I've had older people ask it to me, and my response is always, are you good or bad? Are you always good? Are you always bad? Like, have you never done anything wrong in your life? Have you never thought ill of anybody? Can you say, in all honesty, you've never ever for a second done a bad thing? And they're like, no, I've definitely done bad things. So then I say, well, it's the same thing for an Aurangzeb or a Jahangir or a Shah Jahan. They might not have always been good, but they weren't always bad either.
Yeah, so basically you're saying, there's a tendency for us to look at figures in the past as either all black or all white, and of course that's never the case, right? So you're really hoping through this book for people to get a little bit of nuance when they to understand that there's a lot of gray in all people, just like there is in all of us.
Right? Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, but do you think that was there anything? So a lot of the stories that you're talking about, the many of the kings they come to power by killing their brothers and so on and so forth. So this is something that I think is true of not just the Mughals, but many other kings through Indian and other world history as well. Was there anything in particular that stands out about the Mughals? Of course, biggest empire and all that, but anything else in particular that is different from, say, some of their contemporaries? Like if you think about what was happening in South India around the same time that Akbar was ruling, around the same time you have Krishnadevaraya and so on, right? So, but do you think there's something particularly different about the Mughals?
I think that violence is very difficult for us to understand today, and it is something I struggled with a lot. Like, how can you grow up with someone and see them as your rival? But I think the thing about the Mughals that really stood out to me, which I think is something that gets buried a lot today, is how curious they were about the world that they were in, and how interested they were in just getting to know India. That wasn't necessarily the place that they came from, but a place that they came to belong in. So early on, you have Babur coming in with his army, his Central Asian army, who all sort of hate the weather. And they complain a lot, and a lot of them leave and go back to Kabul because they're like, it's too hot, it's too dusty, we don't like it. And then later on in Shah Jahan's reign, you have him send Murad to Central Asia to reconquer the territories that he's lost to the Persian Shah. And at that time, Murad writes a letter to his dad in the winter saying, it's too cold. I can't deal with this weather. This is not where I belong. I need to come back to Delhi. And I love that particular contrast, because it tells you how quickly these foreigners, these invaders, became part of the landscape that they that they ruled. And it's just one of those things that, it's that question of how long do you have to be in a place before you belong, before you can be said to be from there. So even a Shah Jahan had 3 Rajput grandparents, so he was 3/4 Indian, is the way that people like to measure it. So it's like, how long do you have to be here to start being seen as belonging here? And with the Mughals, I think the thing that fascinates me so much about them is how much they very quickly imbibed what was around them, and they very quickly owned it, became part of it, became interested in it, and collected knowledge about it, and just wanted to know as much as possible. And that is something that I really appreciate about the way that they existed in the world of like Indian politics at the time.
Okay. Perhaps we can open it up to questions from the audience. If anybody would like to, if anybody has any questions, yeah.
Not a question, but it's a business idea right here.
Oh,
So there's a big gap in the narrative history market right here, and that is television. You know, in Europe and in the UK, you have historians like Mary Beard, Simon Sharma,
Yeah.
Lucy Worsley, who do fabulous programs and bring history to life. And I've seen how audiences react to that and develop a great deal of love of history and an interest in history and a way of looking at history which is different from what you just learn in the textbooks as political stuff. So in India, and especially after hearing you speak, which is fantastic, I totally see a TV series
oh, thank you so much.
along with a graphic novel, of course.
Wow.
So an observation.
Thank you.
Yeah. No, I totally agree with that.
I mean, I fell in love with history watching all of those TV shows. So yeah, I would love if there was more of that here. Thank you.
At the back, yeah.
I wanted to ask about food. So I think there has been influences from Mughals to at least my cuisine, Bengali cuisine. I've heard of kalia, I've heard of korma, that they're fundamentally Mughal dishes. I wanted to understand why the Mughals were basically Timurid. So why were they so fond of everything Persian? And why number one, why were there so many Persian influences on Mughal food? And secondly, how did Mughal food evolve with the local ingredients and the local palate and the local this thing? So period of the 300 years, how did it start at the beginning and how did it come to an end is largely, yeah.
Oh, that's a very interesting question. I love food history. That's another thing I wish we had more room for in this book, just more about food. So with the why Persian influence, the way, for example, the way that in the world today we tend to be very Americanized, right? Like we follow American TV shows, we follow American politics. More people outside of the US know about the US than possibly people within the US, and definitely we know more about them than they do about us. The average American knows less about the US than the average Indian, and that's because we have this sort of cultural center. And that cultural center is America. Maybe not for much longer, but sure, until now, that's the case. And so for the Timurid Central Asian world, that center was Persia. Persia was seen as the fount of all things sophisticated, all things culturally significant. And all of these Timurid kings, they were Persianized. They believed that Persian poetry, Persian literature, Persian art was the pinnacle of sophistication, and they aspired to replicate that in their little realms. And that's what the Mughals brought with them to India as well. In terms of the food, I'm not a food historian. The little bit that I did for this, what I did discover is that they did incorporate a lot of the things that the Portuguese brought to India. So like tomatoes, chilies, potatoes, those things became part of the Mughal kitchen because they had been brought to India by the Portuguese at that time. And they also did, so I can give you a story. I can say that khichdi, khichdi became a very popular part of the Mughal diet because Jahangir, as you might imagine, with someone who consumed a lot of alcohol and drugs, had a lot of stomach trouble. And when he was in Gujarat, he tried khichdi. And he was very taken by the restorative powers of khichdi. And so anytime he fell ill, he would ask his cooks to make him a khichdi. Similarly, like say Akbar famously started giving up eating meat on certain days of the week, following his Hindu subjects and his Hindu wives. And later on, he actually gave up eating meat completely. He also apparently would only drink Ganga Jal because he believed that it was better than regular water. So there were many ways in which Mughal food was influenced by where they were. They did bring a lot of food with them. So our naans, our kebabs, all of those come from Central Asia and Persia. They brought these foods with them. So if you go to Old Delhi, you'll probably find a lot of the same food that the Mughals were eating.
You do have one of the spreads on feasting, right? Where you've mentioned a number of the dishes. and What was served.
Ash and Kalia and all of the things that you were talking about, they're mentioned on that particular spread about feasting.
Any other questions? Yeah.
So as we can see, the emperors had a lot of personalities, like not contrasting, but they were different. How did this affect the kingdom or the empire during the transition or during such times where there's a change in the emperor? So how did it affect it?
Oh, that's that's really interesting. It definitely affected how different emperors pursued their policies. So, for example, because of Aurangzeb's obsession with expansion, he spent the last 25 years of his life in the Deccan fighting the Marathas and trying to capture as many forts as possible. And even his own soldiers couldn't understand what the point of this policy was, because they would capture a fort and then they would ride away, and within a few days the Marathas would recapture the fort. So it felt very much like a war of attrition. And that ended up depleting the treasury to the point where there wasn't enough money to pay soldiers in Bahadur Shah I's reign. You had that problem, but you also had the fact that the emperor spent so much time away from the center in Delhi that you had rebellious groups around the capital start seeing it as an opportunity to assert themselves. So clearly, Aurangzeb's personality shaped how things played out around him. Similarly, like an emperor like Muhammad Shah Rangila, he came to the throne in the 18th century. He came to rule the empire at a time when it was already fragmenting, and there were lots and lots of different groups that were seeing this weakness at the center as an opportunity for them to break away from the empire. And what Muhammad Shah Rangila did, instead of responding strongly to it, was to bury his head in the sand. To the great benefit of Hindustani music, he ended up patronizing artists and musicians, and he was part of this sort of cultural renaissance, but at the same time, the empire was actually breaking apart. That's when, say, the princely state of Awadh became formed. That's when you had the princely state of Hyderabad came to exist, all because the emperor was so weak that his primary governors decided, hey, if he's not going to govern, we'll take it on ourselves and we'll create our own little princely kingdoms. So again, you have his personality influencing how he enacted policy and then influencing how other people reacted to that. So yeah, I think definitely personality had a big part to play in how different emperors worked. And early on in an Akbar's reign, you had this strong Mansabdari system, right? You had all of these different people who reported into the emperor, and he was a strong center. But when you have a weak center, that system begins to break down.
Thank you for that answer. I have one quick question. So since we're talking about illustrated book, how do the illustrations work? Like, are they actual copies of something, or have you taken inspiration from originals and tried to replicate them? How do the illustrations work?
Oh, good question. So what Nikhil did was to look at there's a lot of Mughal art that's available online. It's digitized. Most of it isn't in Indian archives anymore. It's in the UK or in the US, and a lot of these museums have digitized the art. So his approach was to look at a lot of different art across different periods and take inspiration from those and create his own art inspired by those. But one thing we did that I'm very like proud of is, for each emperor we wanted to start with a portrait, but we didn't want it to be the kind of formal portraits that you saw. We wanted it to be something like that whole idea of epitomizing an emperor in an image, just as we epitomize that particular emperor in a chapter. We wanted each portrait to stand out. So for the Jahangir portrait, we chose to show Jahangir standing over his painter, and on the facing page there's a zebra. So Jahangir is sort of watching the painter paint the zebra, because we know that he did receive a zebra as a present and he did ask for a painting to be made of it. Also similarly for Shah Jahan, instead of showing Shah Jahan and the Taj Mahal in its final form, what we thought would be fun is, what if we showed the Taj Mahal being constructed? It's not like everybody has seen the Taj Mahal on calendars and desktop backgrounds and wherever, right? And we have like little tiny mini Taj Mahals. It's just so ubiquitous. So for us, the interesting thing was, what if we imagine a moment where he's actually watching it be constructed? And we didn't, instead of showing you his face, we show you his back, and he's turned away and he's looking at the tomb across the river, and it's still in the process of being made. So that part, like where we were trying to take liberties and use the art to tell stories, it's inspired by the Mughals themselves, because they were also using art to tell stories about themselves. So that's kind of how we've approached the art.
Yeah, some of those illustrations are really very poignant, especially this Shah Jahan thing, the choice you've made of showing him from the back. And I think in the text in that is talking about how he's killed this person and that person and this person, and he's become king. But you see him standing all alone with seeing his back. There's something very striking about that image. It really does convey much more than, like, it adds on to the words a different side to his personality, definitely.
Oh, thank you. That's exactly what we wanted.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Yes, we hope to do more. So, because we love doing this illustrated narrative approach, we'd really like to do more on other empires and other dynasties. So we're thinking about maybe tackling the Guptas, which would be completely different, much, much harder, because we don't have helpful autobiographies written by emperors who are telling you all about their innermost thoughts and feelings. So I think that would be, like you were asking about, the Iron Age, that would be a different kind of challenge. How do you humanize when all you have are temple inscriptions or plays and poetry? How do you find who these people are using those sources? So we might work on that next.
Looking forward to that.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions for Shweta? Okay, so I have a question on what was it like working with an illustrator? Because that's not how it often works, right? Often you write your part and then an illustrator works independently on this. Whereas in this, I think it was very much a collaborative effort. Yeah. How was that as a process?
It was incredibly fun. I mean, it wasn't without conflict. We had this little WhatsApp group where we had so many fights over everything. We would say, I would send a chapter in, Nikhil would read it and say, oh, I don't know, it's not working, or this sentence is kind of boring, or, this feels disjointed. And then I would read it and be really angry about his feedback, because I'm like, I spent 3 days writing this. How can you tear it apart like this? But then you go back and you're like, actually, it makes a lot of sense. All of the things you're saying make complete sense to me. And similarly with the art, he would say, oh, let's draw it this way. And I'm like, well, what about if we change this around? Or what if we, instead of showing just the zebra, we also show Jahangir? Or in this spread, we need more detail. You're showing all of these foods, but we're not seeing what's happening in the kitchen. How do we add that? So we're constantly going back and forth on how do we pack as much information into every page and every image, and that means redoing things multiple times. So I think that, but just the fact that we were both very committed to making it as good as possible, like just as sophisticated as possible and as layered as possible really helped. And I do think the fact that I like art and I'm interested in it, and the fact that he is also a writer did help. So it's not like we were completely in our little silos doing our own thing. It was very collaborative in a way that I've rarely worked that way on other book projects, even illustrated book projects, where, like you're saying, I write, I hand it over to the editor liaises with an illustrator, and that's it. But I think the reason the book works so well in terms of the art and the text working together is because we were constantly talking to each other about everything, including, where should this be placed. So right up to publication day, we were fighting over this cover and just going, who should be in which window, where should the name be, should there be a pigeon on top of the box. Like every single little thing was argued over and fought over. And even this interior flap, should there be there was an empty window, and then we're like, oh, maybe we should put a peacock in there. And so it just, every single tiny detail, we wanted it to have an impact. So even the maps, there are 2 maps on the inside front cover and the back cover. So we talked about having the same map, and then I said, oh, but that doesn't make sense. Why not have a slightly different map? The front map will be a pre-map, what did Babur encounter when he came to India, and the back map will be how did things end up at the end of the empire. So in the front, you've got the names of kingdoms that existed then, but in the map at the back, you've got the colonial centers come up. So you've got Madras, you've got Bombay, you've got Calcutta, because by the end of the Mughal Empire, these colonial centers had taken precedence, right? So all of those little things, it was really fun because we would have ideas and talk about them and find ways to put them into action. And that's why I think we want to do more books together, because we had so much fun working on it, including all of the fighting over it. It just made for a good book at the end of it. So yeah, I think I would love to do more collaborative things, just because that collaboration allows for a richer end product.
Right. So it would have been a very different book had you worked the other way, like the usual way where you write
Yeah.
and Okay, lovely. Good to hear. So thank you, Ashwita. This has
Thank
been
you so
really
much.
nice. Anybody else have any questions? If not, we will close. The books are available outside for anybody who wants to buy it. Yeah.
Thank you so much, everyone. This was fun.